Welcome to our deep dive, everyone, where we'll be looking at how marriage was portrayed on the stage in early modern England, and more importantly, what those plays tell us about society back then. We've got three big ones on the docket today: Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, Webster's The Duchess of Malfi, and Cary's The Tragedy of Miriam.
Yeah, those are really going to help us get a handle on the power dynamics, societal expectations. Oh, and even those little subversive challenges to the norms surrounding marriage in this period.
Excited to dig in.
Well, to really get the lay of the land here with marriage in this era, we got to consider the power dynamics, especially the grip of patriarchy. I mean, King James I himself said, and I quote, "I am the husband, and all the whole isle is my lawful wife. I am the head, and it is my body."
Pretty bold, huh?
It really is. You can almost see how male dominance was just baked in, right?
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't just talk either. Take Michael Wentworth, for example. This guy actually put it in his will that his daughters would get a smaller inheritance if they disobeyed his wishes about marriage. Can you imagine the pressure? Even beyond the grave. Wow, talk about control. So marriage back then wasn't just about love and companionship then. What were the big factors?
You got it. Maintaining social order was huge, and maybe even more importantly, making sure power continued through heirs.
So women, especially those high up the social ladder, they must have felt a ton of pressure to just go along with it all.
No doubt about it.
All right, so let's jump into our first play. Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. It's a story packed with interesting characters trying to figure out love and duty and societal expectations. We've got Portia, a wealthy heiress bound by her father's will, and Bassanio, the charmer who's trying to win her hand.
And Portia's situation with the casket test is really telling. Just imagine being forced to follow your dead father's crazy plan for picking your husband, even if you didn't actually want the guy he picked.
I wonder if Shakespeare was giving us a peek into what a lot of women must have felt. Then on the other hand, we have Jessica, Shylock's daughter. She goes in a completely different direction, runs off with Lorenzo, defies her father, and even converts to Christianity to be with him.
Yeah, Jessica's actions definitely say a lot. It's almost like Shakespeare's hinting at these little cracks forming in the rigid societal structure. Like maybe this is where individualism starts to poke through a bit, where love actually dares to challenge tradition.
Fascinating. And you know what else is interesting? How Shakespeare uses the wedding ring to highlight these totally different choices. For Portia and Bassanio, it becomes a test of trust and forgiveness after all that drama. But for Jessica, it's a clean break from her past, a commitment to a new life she built for herself. I wonder if he's saying something about how marriage itself was changing through this symbolism.
Oh, totally. He's weaving in all these layers of meaning,
Yeah.
making us think about that tug of war between tradition and individual choice. But while Shakespeare gives us these glimpses of rebellion, John Webster throws us right into it with the Duchess of Malfi. Now, here's a woman with power who dares to challenge the whole system, with tragic results.
So this is where it gets real. The Duchess, a widow, secretly marries Antonio, who's considered way below her social standing. And that decision sets off a chain of events that leads to her downfall.
And it's a grim reminder of what women faced if they went against the rules. Her brothers, the Cardinal and Ferdinand, are obsessed with power and status. They see her marriage as a direct attack on their authority, and they don't hold back.
Almost like Webster's drawing a line to the real-life case of Lady Arbella, imprisoned for marrying against the king's wishes. Though these weren't just made-up stories.
Exactly. And the play really exposes the hypocrisy behind the brothers' motives. All this talk about honor and family duty, but underneath it all, it's just about control. Webster peels back the layers of power, showing how it can be used and abused.
Okay, so we've got Shakespeare exploring the shifting dynamics within marriage, and Webster showing us what happens when you buck the system. But there's another piece here, right? The role of religion in marriage, especially in a society where faith was everything.
You're right. Both playwrights use religion to look at that messy interplay of power and choice within marriage. In The Merchant of Venice, we see how religious differences can be used to justify prejudice. But in The Duchess of Malfi, religious authority becomes a tool for the brothers to manipulate and control their sister.
So religion itself becomes another way to exert power, shaping marriage in both obvious and not so obvious ways. And that brings us to The Tragedy of Miriam by Elizabeth Cary. Now, this one's a closet drama, meaning it was more for reading than for the stage. What makes this play unique in our exploration of marriage?
Well, Miriam really takes us deep into the psychological mess of a marriage that's gone wrong. It focuses on Miriam and Herod, a couple who start with real affection, but things quickly fall apart into mistrust and tragedy.
And Cary doesn't just stop with their story. She uses other characters to show the many sides of marriage back then. We see arranged marriages for political gain, the pressure to have kids, even the taboo of incestuous relationships to hold on to power.
It's like she's pushing the limits on purpose, using these extreme examples to show how marriage was often a tool, a way to control people socially and politically, often at the cost of their own happiness.
But even with all that darkness, there are glimmers of defiance, aren't there? Like Grafina, who stands up for herself in her marriage. And the chorus, offering a bigger picture view on everything.
Those sparks of resistance are important. They show us that even in this rigid system, some women found ways to push back, to carve out a bit of space for their own will. And it's especially interesting how Carrie uses the chorus. Maybe it's her own voice sneaking in, sharing her personal take on marriage. But maybe we can unpack that a bit more in the next part of our deep dive.
You know, it's amazing how these playwrights, with their own unique styles, they all come back to this one question. What does it even mean to have agency in a marriage? Especially for women living under patriarchy.
Yeah, it's like we're seeing these characters wrestle with the same basic challenges across different stories. Makes you think how much has really changed over time. Are we still dealing with this stuff today? That's a good question. And speaking of changing times, let's go back to The Merchant of Venice for a sec. We talk about the choices Portia and Jessica made, but there's something else we haven't touched on yet. The whole money side of marriage.
Oh, yeah. Money's a big deal in this play. Portia's wealth makes her a really attractive bride. And let's face it, Bassanio's at least partly interested in her fortune. And then there's Jessica. She doesn't just run off with Lorenzo. She takes her dad's jewels and cash, too.
Exactly. This shows how marriage, especially for the upper class, it wasn't just a personal thing, it was an economic deal. It was about keeping wealth in the family, holding on to social status, and making sure the family line continued. Love often took a back seat to all that.
And those same money motives are in the Duchess of Malfi, too. Her brothers aren't just mad that she married down. They think they'll lose their inheritance because of it.
Right. The cardinal even tries to justify his cruelty by saying the Duchess's marriage hurt the family's reputation, which could cost them financially. It all comes down to power and control, social and economic.
Which makes the Duchess's defiance even more powerful. She's willing to risk everything, her wealth, her status, even her life, just for the chance to choose her own happiness. It's a powerful statement about our need for autonomy, don't you think?
For sure. And that theme of defiance is even stronger in the tragedy of Miriam. Even though Miriam ends up a victim of Herod's tyranny, she has moments of incredible strength. She refuses to be a pawn in his political games and even challenges his authority directly.
She's amazing. And then you've got Grafina, challenging traditional gender roles in her own marriage. She speaks her mind, she negotiates with her husband, she even uses intimacy as leverage. Pretty groundbreaking for a play written in the early 1600s, right?
Grafina's a really interesting character because she shows a possible way for women to have some agency in a system that's designed to keep them down. She's not just a submissive wife. She actively shapes her marriage through what she says and does.
And Carrie's use of the chorus in this play adds another layer. It's like a separate voice watching everything, offering a more philosophical take on marriage and the choices these characters make. What do you think about that?
The chorus definitely makes things more complex. You could see it as Carrie's own voice, subtly adding her own views on marriage. Or maybe it's the voice of society as a whole, commenting on the norms and expectations around marriage.
Either way, it makes us think about the play on a deeper level, to really think critically about what Carrie's exploring. This isn't just a simple tragedy. It's a commentary on how society shapes our lives, especially the lives of women.
And it's incredible how these plays, written over 400 years ago, still resonate with us today. They touch on these basic human questions about love, power, choice, and the search for fulfillment in a world that tries to tell us who to be.
It's like we're still having the same conversations, just in a different setting. We're still struggling with that tension between what we want and what society expects, and we're still fighting for the right to define our own relationships.
You said it. And these plays give us a lens to examine those struggles. They remind us that these issues aren't new, and they encourage us to keep questioning, keep pushing back, and keep working for a fairer world, both in marriage and in society as a whole.
So as we go into the last part of our deep dive, let's keep those big questions in mind. How do these plays show us how marriage has evolved? And what can they teach us about the challenges and the triumphs of figuring out love, power, and choice in a world that's always trying to define those things for us? As we really dig into these plays, I keep coming back to this idea of the ideal marriage. Did that even exist in early modern England? Were these playwrights trying to show us real marriages, or were they writing cautionary tales?
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. We got to remember that the whole idea of ideal changes depending on the time and the culture. Back then, the ideal marriage was often seen as one that kept things stable. Kept the power structures in place and produced legitimate heirs. Romantic love wasn't always out of the picture, but it wasn't the main thing.
So it sounds like being practical and fulfilling your duty was more important than love. But within those limits, did people actually find happiness? Do any of these plays show us a marriage that people back then would have considered successful?
Well, let's think about The Merchant of Venice again. Portia and Bassanio's marriage, even though it started kind of strangely, it does seem to strike a balance between duty and love. They have problems, of course, but they work through them together. So even in arranged marriages, there was a chance for real connection and happiness.
But then you have plays like The Duchess of Malfi, where the Duchess tries to find happiness in a love match, and it all ends terribly. Her story seems to be warning us about what can happen when you go against society's rules. And then, the tragedy of Miriam is even darker. Herod's tyranny and Miriam's death show how destructive power can be in a relationship.
That's true. Carrie's play isn't really about showing an ideal marriage. It's more about exposing the ugly side, the potential for manipulation and abuse when power gets out of control. So together, these plays offer a pretty complex view of marriage in early modern England. They show us both the potential for happiness and how vulnerable marriage was to power struggles and societal pressures.
So do you think these playwrights were pushing for some kind of big social change? Were they criticizing marriage as an institution?
I don't think it's that simple. I don't think they were trying to promote any particular agenda. They were showing the complexities of their world, holding up a mirror to society and making the audience question their assumptions and think critically.
It's like they're saying, here's a look at marriage with all its ups and downs. Now what do you think?
Exactly. They're challenging people to think for themselves, to question the status quo, and to imagine different possibilities. And that's why these plays are still relevant today. They're not just historical relics. They're starting points for conversations about love, power, and choice in relationships.
So what does all this mean for us today? Centuries after these plays were written, how can we apply these insights to our own lives and relationships?
Well, one of the big things I take away from this is the importance of critical thinking. We need to question the assumptions we've inherited about marriage, relationships, and gender roles. We need to be aware of how power dynamics work in our own lives and work towards more equality and respect in our partnerships.
And we have to remember that there's no one right way to have a successful marriage. What works for one couple might not work for another. It's about figuring out what's best for each individual relationship, based on shared values, open communication, and a willingness to grow together.
Absolutely. And maybe the most important lesson from these plays is the power of individual choice. We have the power to choose our partners, to define our relationships, and to create a future that matches our values and dreams.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of early modern English drama, let's take a second to appreciate how powerful these plays are. They remind us that the search for love, connection, and fulfillment is something we all share. They encourage us to keep questioning, keep growing, and keep working towards relationships that are based on mutual respect, understanding, and growth.
Well said. And as you come across stories about marriage, whether it's in a book, a movie, or even in your own life, remember to look at it with a critical eye. Ask yourself, what are the power dynamics here? Who's being heard and who's being silenced? And most importantly, how can we as individuals and as a society work towards a world where all relationships are built on equality, respect, and the freedom to choose our own paths?